Morning fog was thick, clinging to the Douglas firs as I locked up my truck at the Hoh River trailhead. The Olympic National Forest looked just as it had the day before, and the day before that. Green, quiet, watching. My boots squeaked against the damp wooden planks of the visitor center porch as I checked the daily log. Nothing unusual noted from overnight. 23 years of ranger service had taught me to tell the difference between routine and something worth noting. The visitor center thermometer read 42 degrees at 7:15, exactly what the forecast had promised. I tapped my radio twice to check the connection, then started my usual route. The main trail glistened with the rain from the night before. 2 miles in, a flash of white caught my attention near the bend where the path narrowed. Not natural. Stepping off the trail, I found an empty energy bar wrapper caught in a salmonberry bush. Nearby, the earth showed a clear boot print, deeper at the heel, indicating someone carrying weight. The tread pattern looked fresh, maybe from yesterday afternoon. More wrappers appeared as I followed the diverted path. The boot print showed a size 11, with a distinctive waffle pattern on the sole. REI brand, probably. The stride suggested a male moving at a steady pace, but not rushing. He'd avoided the muddiest sections, taking a meandering route that gradually pulled away from the established trail. Half a mile in, a blue plastic water bottle lay on its side, cap still secured. Water sloshed inside when I picked it up, about half full. No condensation on the outside. I checked the label. Crystal Geyser. The plastic still had some give when squeezed. Not left there long. Visitor went off trail. I noted into my recorder. Male traveling alone, based on the single track pattern. No signs of distress in the gait. The prints continued for another quarter mile before leading to a rocky outcrop overlooking a small ravine. Gray stone jutted from the hillside like broken teeth. The ground hardened here, but not enough to completely lose the trail. Yet the footprint simply stopped. Kneeling, I examined the last clear impression. The depth remained consistent with previous steps. No jump, no sudden weight shift. The surrounding vegetation stood undisturbed. No broken branches indicated climbing. No scuff marks suggested a fall. My radio crackled. "Mitchell, you copy? Go ahead, Peterson. Got a situation." Missing person report just came in. Kenneth Hayes, 34, software engineer from Seattle. Rental car has been sitting in the lot since yesterday morning. Solo hiker. No return to accommodation. Something cold settled between my shoulder blades that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What's the description?" I asked, though I already knew. 5 feet 11 inches, brown hair, glasses. Last seen wearing a navy rain jacket, tan hiking pants, carrying a blue backpack, size 11 boots. The water bottle felt suddenly heavy in my hand. I've got a trail. Send coordinates now. The GPS unit beeped as I marked the position. 47 degrees, 51 minutes, 38 seconds north. 123 degrees, 56 minutes, 12 seconds west. The spot where a man had apparently walked into nothing. Found some personal items and tracks heading off trail. The path ends at Kramer Ridge Outcrop. I didn't add that it ended impossibly. Requesting additional personnel for a search pattern. I'll secure the area. While waiting for backup, I photographed the last footprint, the water bottle, the energy bar wrappers, evidence for a case that might have a simple explanation. People got lost. People made unusual decisions when disoriented. But something felt wrong about the abrupt end of the trail. The way the boot prints maintained an even spacing until they didn't exist anymore. The half-full water bottle, with no signs of panic or hurry. This wasn't my first search and rescue operation. Standard procedure dictated calling the subject's name, establishing a perimeter, checking for signs of wildlife disturbance. I followed each step mechanically while my mind cataloged other cases, other trails that ended without explanation, other searches where the evidence contradicted natural possibilities. The forest remained silent, except for the distant rush of the Ho River. No birds called from the canopy. No wind stirred the leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing as I waited for a response that never came. The helicopter's rhythmic thrum competed with radio's crackling as I reached the command post. 3 hours since finding the last boot print. Search and rescue had set up a collapsible table under a blue tarp at the trailhead parking lot. Maps spread across the surface, weighted at the corners with rocks. 12 volunteers in bright orange vests clustered around James Peterson, the veteran ranger who'd called in Kenneth Hayes's disappearance. "Mitchell's here," James said, nodding toward me. "He found a trail." I laid my GPS unit on the table and pointed to the marked coordinates. "Last clear footprint stops here. Single set of tracks leading off the main trail about 2 miles in. Subject was moving confidently. No signs of distress or disorientation in the gait pattern." The volunteers leaned forward, studying the topographical lines. Search coordinator Helen Vasquez traced a finger along the contour markers. "The ridge drops off steeply to the east," she noted. "Could he have slipped?" "No disturbance to indicate a fall," I said. "Soil that would have shown disruption. Track just ends clean on level ground." Ranger dogs sniffed Kenneth's blue water bottle, sealed in a plastic bag. Their handlers stood ready at the perimeter, leads taut with anticipation. Standard procedure. I'd seen it dozens of times, yet something in the air felt different. Heavier. "We'll run a standard grid search, half-mile radius from the last known position," Helen announced, marking sectors on the map. "Teams of 2. Radio check every 15 minutes. Mitchell, you'll guide team 1 back to where the trail ends." The mention of radio checks pushed another memory forward. 5 years back, different search, same forest. "Mitchell." Helen's voice pulled me back. "Copy that," I said, accepting the clipboard with assignment details. While Helen continued briefing the teams, my mind drifted to the search for Tyler Brooks, 5 years old. Dark blonde hair that stuck up in the back, missing front teeth that gave him a distinctive lisp. He'd vanished from the Pine Ridge campground while his parents slept. The radio had been unreliable then, too, something I'd attributed to the terrain. "All right, people, move out," Helen called, breaking into my thoughts. The volunteer paired with me was Doug Keller, retired forestry service with 17 years experience, reliable, observant. We started back up the trail, boots crunching on the damp earth. "You've got that look," Doug said after we'd walked 5 minutes in silence. "What look?" "The one that says this isn't your first rodeo with something weird." I adjusted my pack. "You remember the Brooks boy, Tyler? Summer of 2018. Doug nodded. 3 days missing. Found him by Coldwater Creek, wasn't it? Coldwater. Yeah. 1/4 mile from where his parents said he'd been sleeping. Kid wasn't dehydrated, wasn't hungry clean, like he just wandered off an hour before. We reached the point where Kenneth's tracks diverted from the main trail. I pointed to the barely visible impression in the softened earth. Doug crouched, examining it without touching. "Good tread pattern," he observed. "Consistent depth. Follow me," I said, leading him along the same path I'd traced that morning. As we walked, the sounds of the other search teams faded. The forest had that particular quality of silence that makes you lower your voice without thinking about it. Doug matched my deliberate pace, stopping when I stopped, looking where I pointed. Professional courtesy. "The Brooks boy," Doug prompted after we'd been quiet too long. "Something else about that case bothered you." I stepped over a fallen branch. "When we found him, he kept talking about the fuzzy man who'd been taking care of him. Said this man was tall, covered in dark fur, talked without moving his mouth. Kids and their imaginations. Yeah, that's what everyone said." I paused at a narrow stream crossing. I interviewed that kid 3 separate times. His story never changed, not one detail. Most kids that age can't maintain a lie for 15 minutes, let alone 3 days. We reached the rocky outcrop where Kenneth's trail had vanished. The last boot print remained undisturbed, protected by the small marker I'd left earlier. Doug circled the area slowly, examining the ground inch by inch. "Nothing," he confirmed. "No sign of continuation, no scuff marks on the rocks." My radio squawked. "Team 1, check in." Helen's voice sounded thin, distant. "Team 1 at target location," I responded. "No new findings." Static answer before Helen's voice pushed through the interference. "Copy. Teams 3 and 6 reporting equipment issues." I adjusted the frequency dial. "Repeat last base." "You're breaking up." Nothing but crackling static. I switched the radio off, then on again. The display flickered before steadying. "Radio issues," I noted aloud. "Had the same problem during the Brooks search." Doug looked up. "Could be the ridge blocking the signal." "Could be." But it wasn't. The ridge ran east-west. Command post was north. Clear line of sight should have existed for radio transmission. The telltale whump-whump of helicopter blades approached from west. The search chopper appeared above the tree line, moving in a slow grid pattern. I raised my hand, though I knew they probably couldn't see us through the canopy. "Let's expand outward," I suggested. "You take northwest, I'll go southeast. Stay within visual contact." Doug nodded and moved away, orange vest vanishing, then reappearing between tree trunks. I walked slowly toward the edge of the ridge, scanning for any sign of disturbance. 20 feet from where Kenneth's track ended, I found it. A small blue thread caught on a blackberry thorn, same color as Kenneth's jacket, according to the report. I carefully removed the thread and placed it in an evidence bag. This put Kenneth's path continuing toward the ridge edge, despite the lack of footprints. I moved forward, eyes on the ground, until I reached the drop-off. 50-foot descent, steep but not vertical. Survivable if someone fell, though injuries would be likely. "Doug," I called. "Got something." He appeared at my side a moment later, slightly winded. "What did you find?" I showed him the thread. "Could have blown here, but it's not degraded by weather." "Fresh." Doug peered over the edge. "Think he went down there?" "Maybe, but I didn't believe it." No signs of a slide, no disturbed vegetation or soil. If Kenneth had gone over, he'd have done it with a perfectly clean leap. Not impossible, but unlikely. My radio crackled again. "All teams back to base. Weather system." The rest dissolved into static. I looked up. Dark clouds had gathered while we searched, heavy and gray against the afternoon sky. The forecast hadn't predicted rain, but mountain weather changed quickly. Standard procedure called for suspending search operations during electrical storms. We should head back, Doug said, eyeing the sky. Yeah. As we turned to leave, something cold touched the back of my neck. Not rain, more like a breath. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved except branches swaying in the increasing wind. You okay? Doug asked. Thought I heard something, but that wasn't true. I hadn't heard anything. I'd felt something. The same sensation I'd experienced 5 years ago when Tyler Brooks described the fuzzy man. The feeling that something was watching us from just beyond what we could see. We made our way back to the main trail as the first drops of rain began to fall. I thought about Tyler's absolute certainty when he told his story, perched on a hospital bed with dinosaur bandages on his elbows. He was nice, the boy had insisted, but not a person. Too big, too fuzzy. He showed me things in the trees. I'd asked what things, and Tyler had looked at me with that directness only children manage. People, he'd said, sleeping people standing up in the trees. I dismissed it then as traumatic confabulation, the brain creating a narrative from fear and confusion. Standard psychological response in children. Now, watching the search teams converge back at the command post as afternoon clouds darkened to evening, I wasn't so certain. Kenneth Hayes had vanished, just like Tyler Brooks, except Kenneth hadn't come back. Not yet, anyway. The forest had taken something, and I was beginning to think it might not be the first time. The shadows stretched longer as evening approached. Our search line, 7 people spaced 10 yards apart, moved methodically through the forest, sweeping north to south across the grid sector Helen had assigned us. Every 5 minutes, someone would call Kenneth's name, the sound dying quickly among the Douglas firs. Kenneth Hayes. Doug's voice carried from the far end of our line. 10 seconds later, Michelle Adams picked it up from the next position. Kenneth Hayes, can you hear us? The ritual continued until it reached me. I drew a deep breath and called, Kenneth Hayes, National Park Service. Signal if you can hear us. Nothing answered but soft static from my radio. The interference had grown worse over the past hour. I checked the display. Full battery, but the signal strength indicator flickered between 1 and 2 bars, despite our proximity to the repeater station on Kingsley Ridge. I pulled out my GPS unit again. The screen showed only blank pixels where coordinates should have appeared. I tapped it against my palm twice, watched the display flicker back to life for 3 seconds, then fade again. Anyone else having equipment issues? I called to the line. A chorus of affirmatives came back. Michelle held up her compass. Needles spinning. Can't get a reliable bearing. Standard issue Park Service compass. Reliable in thunderstorms, underwater, and every terrain we'd encountered in 15 years. Now it spun like a carnival wheel. I glanced upward. The sky remained clear between the tree branches. No electrical storms, no obvious interference sources. The afternoon clouds had burned off rather than bringing the rain we'd expected. Normal conditions by every measure except the equipment failures. We pressed forward, maintaining visual contact across the line. The forest had gone strangely quiet around us. Pacific Northwest woodlands were never truly silent. Even in winter, something always rustled, called, or moved. But as we approached the grid coordinates where Kenneth's tracks had ended, even the wind seemed to die. Doug slowed his pace, matching mine. You notice how quiet it got? I nodded. No squirrels, no jays, not even insects. The forest floor should have bustled with beetles and ants this time of year. I stooped to check a rotting log. perfect habitat for all manner of crawling things. Lifted it carefully, empty underneath except for packed soil and old pine needles. A sharp whistle cut through the silence. All heads turned toward the sound. 50 yards ahead, Ranger and his handler had stopped. The German shepherd stood rigid, ears forward, tail straight out behind him. We converged on their position, collapsing the search line as protocol dictated when something was found. The handler crouched beside Ranger, one hand on the dog's shoulder. The animal trembled beneath his touch. "What's he got?" I asked. "Nothing. That's the problem," the handler replied. "He was tracking fine, then just stopped. Won't go forward." Ranger had 8 years of search and rescue experience. He found lost hikers in blizzards, traced victims through ash after forest fires, never faltered once. Now he whined softly, backing into his handler's legs when urged forward. "Maybe he smells something we don't," Michelle suggested. "Bear. Cougar. He's trained for predator encounters," the handler said. "This is different. Never seen him like this." I stepped past them, moving slowly toward whatever had spooked the dog. The trees ahead looked identical to those behind us. Mixed old growth, predominantly Douglas fir with western hemlock interspersed. Fern understory, typical ground cover, nothing visually distinct. The air changed first. 10 steps ahead of the group, I felt it thicken, like walking into invisible cobwebs. The temperature dropped noticeably, 5 degrees at least. My exposed skin prickled with goosebumps. "Feel that?" I asked without turning. "Feel what?" Doug had followed a few paces behind. I reached my hand back. "Step forward and tell me what you notice." Doug moved alongside me, then stopped abruptly. Temperature drop. "Like a pocket of cold air," I confirmed. Know when to explain it. Michelle joined us, notebook already open. 45 degrees here, she said, checking her thermometer. It was 52 back where Ranger stopped. 7-degree differential in less than 10 feet with no physical barrier or elevation change to explain it. Michelle noted the readings with the precise handwriting she used for official documentation. I moved forward again, pushing through the resistance. The sensation wasn't physical. Nothing actually blocked my path, but each step required deliberate effort, like wading through invisible molasses. 20 yards ahead, the feeling suddenly disappeared. Normal forest air surrounded me again. Normal temperature. I turned back to the others. "It stops here." I marked the position with surveyor's tape. Cold spots contained to about a 20-yard diameter. The handler remained at the perimeter with Ranger. The dog sat now, refusing to move either forward or back, eyes fixed on something none of us could see. Michelle circled the perimeter, taking temperature readings every 5 feet. "The cold area forms almost a perfect circle," she called, centered right where Kenneth's tracks ended. The implications settled uncomfortably. Natural phenomena rarely formed perfect geometric shapes. Cold air sinks into depressions, follows terrain features, dissipates in gradual gradients. This was different, deliberate feeling. My radio crackled suddenly. Helen's voice pushed through the static. "All teams check in. Daylight fading. Prepare for night operations or return to base." I pressed the transmit button. "Team 1 Sector 6B. We've located an anomalous temperature zone. Request additional equipment for overnight monitoring." The radio hissed, catching only fragments of Helen's response. "Confirm. Jacket found." 20 feet up. Impossible position. Repeat last message. I said, or breaking up. I answered. Nothing but static. I tucked the radio away and turned to the group. We should head back before full dark. Mark this location for tomorrow's sweep. Michelle finished her notations. Should we set up monitoring equipment now? I considered this. Standard procedure recommended against leaving expensive equipment unattended overnight, but something about this site warranted an exception. Set up one thermal camera and the digital recorder, I decided. We'll retrieve them in the morning. The forest silence pressed in as Michelle and Doug secured the equipment to a tree trunk facing the cold spot. The sun had dipped below the ridge line, casting long shadows through the understory. We'd have 40 minutes of usable twilight to find our way back to base camp. Everyone stay close, I instructed. Headlamps on even while it's still light. Radio check every 5 minutes, regardless of reception quality. We moved back the way we'd come, following our own boot prints and flagging tape. Ranger led now, eager to put distance between himself and whatever had spooked him. The dog's behavior bothered me more than the temperature anomaly. Animals sense things humans missed. Base camp came into view just as true darkness settled over the forest. Portable floodlights illuminated the command area where Helen stood beside the topographical map, marking sectors with colored pins. Nearby, 3 other search teams huddled around a propane heater, drinking coffee from steel thermoses. Mitchell, Helen called as we approached. Team 3 found something. She led us to a folding table where a navy blue rain jacket lay sealed in a clear evidence bag. Kenneth's jacket, matching the description from his missing person report. The fabric appeared clean, except for a small tear along one sleeve. Where? I asked. North Ridge Trail, junction of sectors 4 and 5. Helen pointed to the map. Hanging from a western hemlock branch, 20 feet up. Caught on a broken limb, Doug suggested. The team leader who'd found it, a bearded man named Marcus, shook his head. Branch was intact. Jacket was deliberately draped over it, perfectly centered, sleeves hanging down equal length on both sides. Like someone placed it there, I said. Exactly like that. Marcus rubbed his beard. No way it blew up there or got caught accidentally. And no human could reach that branch without climbing gear. Any signs of climbing? I asked. None. No marks on the trunk. No rope burns on the branches, and the branch itself couldn't support an adult's weight. A small crowd had gathered around us. Now I examined the jacket more closely through the plastic. North Face brand, men's large. The tear along the sleeve looked clean, not the jagged rip that would result from snagging on branches. More like a knife cut. Any blood? I asked. Lab will check, Helen said. Nothing visible. I glanced at my watch. Full night had fallen, and the temperature would drop another 10 degrees before morning. Search protocols required scaling back overnight operations to conserve resources, with only essential personnel remaining on site. We found an anomalous cold spot centered where Kenneth's tracks ended, I told Helen. Left monitoring equipment in place. Temperature differential of 7 degrees within a perfectly circular area. Helen made a notation on her clipboard. Equipment failures reported by all teams, compasses malfunctioning, GPS units dropping signal, even the satellite phones giving us trouble. I'll stay overnight, I offered. Keep an eye on the base camp, review today's findings, prepare for morning operations. Helen looked relieved. Having a senior ranger on site overnight would maintain continuity for the search. Take the command tent. We've got a portable heater and cot set up. The other search teams began packing up as Helen assigned the overnight rotation. 2 people on 4-hour shifts. Most volunteers would return to town for sleep and fresh supplies, coming back at first light. Michelle approached as I checked the fuel level in the generator. "I'm staying too," she said quietly. "Something's not right here, and I want to document everything properly." I nodded, grateful for her methodical approach. The cold spot bothers me, and Ranger's reaction. "Did you notice anything else there? Any smell, sound, visual distortion?" "Just the resistance, like walking through heavy air." I adjusted the generator's choke. "But there's something else. This isn't the first time equipment's failed during a search in this forest." Michelle waited, letting me continue at my own pace. "The Brooks case 5 years back. Radio interference in the same pattern. GPS units showing incorrect coordinates. Compasses giving false readings. The 5-year-old who went missing for 3 days." Michelle said she'd been working in Olympic for 7 years now. Would have heard about it. "Tyler Brooks. Found him a quarter-mile from his campsite. No worse for wear. Kid claimed he'd been with someone he called the Fuzzy Man. Said this being showed him sleeping people standing in trees." Michelle's expression remained neutral, but her posture stiffened slightly. "You think there's a connection?" "I think there's a pattern," I corrected. "Whether it's significant or coincidental remains to be seen." The generator hummed to life, powering the perimeter lights around command area. Most of the search teams had departed now, headlights winding down the access road toward town. Only 6 of us remained. Helen, Michelle, myself, and 3 volunteers for the overnight rotation. "I'm going to review the case files," I told Michelle, "cross-reference with other searches that had equipment failures or unusual findings." She nodded. "I'll organize today's field notes and prepare the sector maps for tomorrow." We worked in silence as the forest settled into the night around us. The usual nocturnal sounds gradually returned. An owl calling from the ridge. Small creatures rustling in the underbrush beyond our light perimeter. Whatever stillness had enveloped us during the afternoon search seemed to have retreated with darkness. I pulled out the folder containing notes from Tyler Brooks's case. The boy's statement, recorded 3 separate times by different. The interviewers stuck to the same core details. The fuzzy man was incredibly tall, even taller than my dad, and my dad is seriously tall with dark fur covering his whole body. It didn't speak out loud but communicated in other ways. It showed Tyler things in the forest that he was forbidden from sharing with anyone. And most disturbingly, he said more people were coming to find him, grown-up people who were after secrets. I stole a glance at Kenneth's jacket, now sealed in an evidence bag. He was a software engineer from Seattle who'd come alone to the Olympic National Forest. The jacket was hanging in a place no one could have reached without specialized climbing gear, but no such equipment had been found. Outside, the darkness seemed to press in against our little circle of artificial light. I made a snap decision and reached for my pack. "I want to check the monitoring equipment," I told Michelle. "I'll be back in 2 hours." She looked up from her maps, her expression firm. "Not alone." "Absolutely not. Protocol requires pairs after dark." She was right, of course. "I'll take one of the volunteers with me." While I was getting my gear ready, one of the overnight volunteers, a solid-looking guy in his 30s with search and rescue experience, came over. "I'll go with you," he offered. His name was Tom Reeves, a local firefighter who often helped with wilderness searches. The German shepherd lifted his head when he saw us moving, but didn't get up from his spot by the heater. The dog had been unusually subdued since we'd gotten back to camp. As we gathered our equipment, I noted the time in the log, 9:12 p.m. We were going to hike to the anomalous cold spot, check the equipment, and be back before midnight. Standard procedure with a clear objective. Yet, as we left the camp's lights and plunged into the forest darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by anything human, but by the forest itself, by whatever had snatched Kenneth Hayes from a perfectly visible trail and left his jacket hanging 20 feet above the ground like some kind of message or warning. Tom and I reached the cold spot without any trouble, although our headlamps seemed dimmer than usual in the oppressive darkness. The monitoring equipment looked untouched, still recording just as we'd left it. But something about the area had definitely changed. The temperature difference had spiked to nearly 12 degrees. "This isn't natural," Tom muttered, zipping his jacket up tighter. We finished our check quickly, neither of us wanting to stick around any longer than we had to. The return trip proved to be much harder. Our compasses spun uselessly, and the flagging tape we'd put up seemed to disappear in our light beams. Twice, we found ourselves walking in circles, even though we were sure we were following a straight path. It was almost midnight when we finally stumbled back into camp. Michelle looked up, visibly relieved. "You're late," she said. "I was about to send out another team." I explained that we'd gotten disoriented while Tom went to warm himself by the heater. Something about the forest had shifted that night. The anomalies were spreading, getting stronger. I made detailed notes in the log, then checked the time. 12:23 a.m. I need to get some rest, I told Michelle. But I don't want to sleep in the command tent. I need to clear my head. She nodded, understanding. "Where will you be?" "My truck at the forest access road. Radio if anything changes." Tom had already crawled into his sleeping bag near the heater. He gave me a tired wave as I gathered my things. The night's experience had definitely rattled both of us, even though neither of us wanted to admit it. I drove the quarter-mile to the access road and parked where I could see both the forest and the road leading back to civilization. Something told me I needed to stay connected, with one foot in each world. As I reclined a seat and pulled my sleeping bag over me, exhaustion slammed into me like a physical blow. My last thought before sleep took me was of Kenneth's jacket hanging impossibly high in a tree and Tyler's words about sleeping people standing in trees. Tomorrow would bring new searches, new discoveries. But tonight, I needed to get away from whatever was watching us from the depths of the forest. Something yanked me awake at 4:27 a.m. It wasn't a sound, more like the sudden feeling of being watched. I lay still in the reclined driver's seat of my truck, sleeping bag bunched around my waist, and listened. All I could hear was the soft patter of light rain on the roof and the occasional drip from the trees overhead. I checked my watch again. First flight wouldn't break for another hour and 17 minutes, according to the almanac. The windows were fogged from my breath. I wiped a clear spot on the driver's side and peered out. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it, at the junction of the forest access road, facing both the main road and the trail that led back to our command post. Standard position for a quick response in either direction. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled on my boots and jacket. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and sidearm, then stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air felt thick with moisture, carrying that unique smell of wet pine needles and damp earth that defined mornings in the Olympic National Forest. I radioed the overnight team at base camp. Mitchell checking in. "Anything to report?" Static hissed for 3 seconds before Michelle's voice came through. All quiet. Equipment still malfunctioning, though. Temperature dropped to 36 about an hour ago. Copy that. I'm heading back to camp now. The beam of my flashlight cut a tunnel through the darkness as I walked. Mist had settled in patches across the access road. My boots left temporary impressions in the condensation, which filled back in seconds after I passed. I decided to take a slight detour toward Kramer Ridge, wanting to revisit the spot where Kenneth's trail had ended the day before. Something about that spot had bothered me ever since we'd found his last boot print. As I approached the outcrop, I noticed something to my right, a shape that didn't belong among the trees. I swung my light toward it and froze in my tracks. The staircase stood in a small clearing 15 yards from where Kenneth's footprints had vanished. Not the rough-hewn steps you sometimes find on steep backcountry trails. This was a formal indoor-style staircase rising from the forest floor, complete with polished wooden handrails and decorative spindles. I approached slowly, sweeping my light across the structure. 15 steps climbing to nowhere, ending abruptly in mid-air with no platform or destination. The wood gleamed with a rich amber finish of furniture-grade oak. Each tread measured exactly 7.5 inches high with an 11-inch run. Standard residential dimensions. The craftsmanship was flawless. Perfect mitered corners, consistent spacing between balusters, handrails that curved with architectural precision. I knelt and examined the newel post at the bottom. The carving showed intricate detail, leaves and vines wrapping around the column. Not a single chip or crack marred the surface. I touched it with my fingertips. The wood felt warm despite the morning chill. This is impossible, I muttered to myself, knowing it wasn't quite true. Unlikely, certainly, but my 23 years of ranger service had taught me that impossible was a flexible concept in certain parts of these woods. I stepped back and examined the ground around the staircase. No tool marks, no material scraps, no disturbed soil indicating construction. The structure simply rested on the forest floor, as if it had grown there. The lowest step touched the ground with perfect alignment. No gaps, no shimming to accommodate the uneven terrain. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Mitchell, you copy?" James Peterson's voice sounded gravelly, with what seemed like too little sleep. I thumbed the talk button. "Copy, Jim. Where are you?" "Just arrived at the access lot. Saw your truck empty. Everything okay?" I hesitated before responding. "You might want to see this. I'm at Kramer Ridge Outcrop, exactly where Kenneth's trail ended yesterday." On my way. While I waited, I circled the staircase twice, keeping a 10-foot distance. No footprints marked the ground except my own. No animal tracks either, which struck me as odd. Even in the wet conditions, something should have passed through this clearing recently. Deer, raccoon, even insects. The soil looked untouched. I pulled out my camera and took photos from multiple angles, making sure to include reference points for scale. The structure should have appeared out of place in the middle of the wilderness. Yet somehow it didn't. It looked right, as if the forest had adjusted itself to the staircase rather than the other way around. My light caught something near the third step, a small object half buried in the dirt. I crouched and carefully brushed away the soil. It was a wristwatch with a broken leather band. I photographed it in place before gently lifting it. The face was cracked but still legible. The hands had stopped at 317. I turned it over. No manufacturer's mark or serial number, just a smooth metal back. I slipped it into an evidence bag and recorded the time and location in my notebook. The sound of approaching footsteps made me look up. James emerged from the trees, his flashlight beam bobbing through the mist. He'd been with the Park Service for 28 years, the last 17 in Olympic. Salt and pepper beard, weathered face, eyes that had seen enough to stay calm in most emergencies. He stopped when his light found the staircase. Not a dramatic freeze, just the practiced stillness of someone who's learned to assess before reacting. "Well, I'll be damned," he said finally. Just that. I stood up, pocketing the bagged watch. "You've seen one before." It wasn't a question. His lack of surprise told me everything. James approached slowly, his light tracing the same path mine had. Up the stairs, along the railings, down to where the structure met the ground. "Third one I've encountered," he said. "First was in Gifford Pinchot, 1997. Second in Mount Baker Snoqualmie, 2004. He circled the staircase, keeping the same careful distance I had. They don't usually show up this close to access roads. "What are they?" I asked, though I already suspected James didn't have a complete answer. He shrugged, the gesture barely visible in the dim light. "Official stance is they don't exist. And the unofficial stance, we document. We report through proper channels, and we stay the hell away from them." The firmness in his voice carried weight. I waited, knowing there was more. James had that particular silence of a man choosing his next words carefully. "Collins in Yellowstone climbed one back in 2018, he said finally. "Search team found him 3 days later, 20 miles from where the stairs had been. Couldn't speak except in sounds no one recognized. Medical took him to Bozeman General. Last I heard, he still hasn't said a coherent word." The rain started again, light drops speckling the polished wood. The staircase remained dry, water beating and rolling off as if repelled. "They're not always stairs," James continued. "Sometimes they're doors standing alone in clearings. Once in a while, a hallway that turns corners into nowhere." He gestured at the structure. "But stairs are the most common. Always perfect construction, always leading nowhere." "How long do they stay?" "Variable. Days, sometimes weeks. Then they're gone, like they never existed." James stepped back to stand beside me. "Rangers have been reporting them since the 30s at least. No pattern to locations, no commonality except they're always in deep wilderness. Or were until this one." "The watch," I said, pulling out the evidence bag. "Found it by the third step." James examined it without touching the plastic. 3:17, he noted. "Always the same time. Always." He nodded. "Every watch or clock found near these structures shows 3:17 a.m. We think it's based on witness statements." He handed the bag back. "The department has a file, not digitized, not official. Paper records dating back to 1932. And nobody's connected this to missing hikers before." The question came out sharper than I'd intended. "People have tried. Rangers mostly. There's a correlation, but proving causation." He let the sentence trail off. "Science needs repeatability. These things aren't repeatable, aren't predictable, so they stay unofficial. Rangers warn each other, pass down what we know. But nothing goes in the training manuals." I felt a prickling sensation at the base of my skull. Not quite pain, more like pressure building slowly. "We should mark this location," I said. "Set up a perimeter. James shook his head. Won't help. He'll just move it. Best practice is to note the coordinates, photograph everything, and notify headquarters through secure channels. Form 37B, the maintenance request form. I asked, confused. That's what it looks like in the system, but it's flagged for special routing. James checked his watch. We've got about 40 minutes before the search teams arrive for the morning briefing. You document this. I'll handle the 37B, and Kenneth Hayes, Emily Carter, the other missing persons. James sighed. We keep searching exactly as protocol dictates. We report everything we find through normal channels, and we stay off the stairs. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing, Dave. Don't tell the volunteers about this. Not yet. Let me make some calls first. As his footsteps faded back toward the access road, I stood alone with the staircase. The rain had stopped again, leaving the forest wrapped in that strange stillness that sometimes follows precipitation. No dripping from leaves, no rustling undergrowth, not even the distant call of a Stellar's jay. I took out my GPS unit to mark the exact coordinates. The screen flickered, numbers rearranging themselves into nonsense before settling on latitude 47 degrees 51 minutes 38 seconds north. Longitude 123 degrees 56 minutes 12 seconds west. I checked the reading twice, then pulled out my notebook and flipped back several pages. The coordinates matched exactly where Kenneth Hayes' footprints had ended yesterday. Something drew my attention back to the staircase. The polish would seem to glow faintly in a pre-dawn light, warm and inviting despite the surrounding gloom. I found myself moving toward it without conscious thought, one hand reaching for the handrail. The wood felt smooth beneath my palm, vibrating almost imperceptibly. A slight warmth radiated up my arm. One foot lifted toward the first step. I jerked backward, breaking contact. Sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the morning chill. My heart pounded against my ribs. Mitchell to base, I said into my radio, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm setting up a temporary observation point near Kramer Ridge. Need thermal imaging equipment and the digital recorder from yesterday's deployment. Michelle's response came through clearly, despite the earlier interference. Copy that. I'll bring them when the morning teams assemble. I moved back 15 yards and sat on a fallen log, keeping the staircase in full view. Dawn had begun to lighten the eastern sky, gray light filtering through the canopy. The structure remained unchanged, perfect, pristine, impossible. I knew I should return to base camp for the morning briefing. The search for Kenneth Hayes would continue regardless of what I'd found. But something kept me rooted to that log, watching the staircase as if it might move when I blinked. It didn't move, but as sunlight finally broke through the trees, hitting the polished wood directly for the first time, I could have sworn I heard something like distant voices carrying through a long corridor, speaking words just beyond my understanding. The staircase had appeared for a reason, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Kenneth Hayes had encountered one too. Perhaps he'd even climbed those 15 steps into empty air, into whatever waited at 3:17 in the morning. The helicopter's rotor wash bent the treetops as it swept low over Sector 5. 8 of us stood in a clearing half a mile from the command post, necks craned upward as the Bell 407 executed a grid search pattern. The pilot maintained precise 90-degree turns at each quadrant boundary, maximizing the thermal imaging coverage. Still think this is a waste of fuel, James muttered beside me. Rain had plastered his gray hair to his forehead. If the thermal was going to pick him up, we'd have found him yesterday. I didn't answer. The weather had cleared enough for flight operations, but the morning fog still clung to the valleys and gullies where a body might be hidden, where Kenneth might be lying injured or worse. My radio clicked 3 times before the pilot's voice crackled through the static. Ground team, we're getting some unusual readings half a click northeast of your position. Coordinates coming through now. Michelle copied down the numbers on her waterproof notepad. That puts us near Blackwater Creek Junction, she said, right where Team 3 reported the clothing in the trees. James shouldered his pack. Let's move. Mitchell, you take point. I oriented my compass, noted the bearing, and started through the understory. The group fell into a practice formation behind me, James and Michelle, then 4 search and rescue volunteers spaced 5 yards apart. The 8th member of our team, the county medical examiner, followed at the rear. Standard protocol brought medical along when thermal imaging suggested findings compatible with human remains. We moved quickly but deliberately, calling Kenneth's name every 100 yards. The forest had regained its normal sounds overnight. Birdsong above, small creatures rustling in the ferns. But something still fell off. The air hung too, still between the trunks, almost pressurized. 20 minutes in, Robert Wilson's voice crackled over the radio. Team 2 to base. We've located additional clothing items in Sector 4A. Men's hiking sock caught on a branch 30 feet up. Second item appears to be a torn backpack strap. Copy that. Helen responded from command. Mark and photograph, but don't disturb. Continue your sweep pattern. James made a small grunt of acknowledgement. This wasn't the first time we'd found personal items suspended high in the canopy. 2 years back, a missing trail runner's baseball cap had turned up wedged in a branch 40 feet above ground. The official report cited storm winds as the probable cause, though no severe weather had passed through during the search window. We reached Blackwater Creek at 11:23. The water ran high from recent rains, splashing over mossy rocks with enough force to create a constant background hiss. Perfect sound coverage if someone had been calling for help. Should be just ahead, Michelle said, checking her coordinates against the helicopter's report. The tree line opened slightly as we approached a stand of old-growth Douglas firs. Their massive trunks, 7 to 8 feet in diameter, supported a canopy that began nearly 100 feet up. Unlike second-growth forest, little undergrowth survived in their deep shade. I smelled it before I saw anything. The faint, distinctive odor that experienced search teams recognize instantly. Sweet, but also like chemical and biological processes breaking down without normal bacterial action. Not strong yet, but unmistakable. We've got something, I called, raising my fist to halt the line. The medical examiner moved up from the rear, unslinging his equipment bag. Where? I scanned the ground, then the middle distance, finding nothing. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. James tilted his head back, eyes tracking up the nearest Douglas fir. His expression changed subtly, the minute shift from concentration to recognition. There, he said quietly, 40 feet up, Western Fork. We all looked where he pointed. Between 2 massive branches, a splash of blue broke the uniform green and brown of the bark. As my eyes adjusted to the distance, the shape resolved into fabric, then into clothing, then into the unmistakable form of a human body wedged into the crook of the tree. Jesus, one of the volunteers whispered. The medical examiner pulled out his binoculars. Female, appears to be wearing hiking clothes, blue jacket, tan pants. Can't assess condition from here. Michelle flipped through her missing persons file. Emily Carter, she said after a moment. 29 years old, reported missing 3 weeks ago. Solo hiker, experienced backcountry camper. She passed around a photograph from the report. I studied the image. Emily smiled at the camera. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, freckles across her nose. Her missing person flyer listed her as 5'7", 140 pounds. Last seen wearing a blue North Face jacket and khaki hiking pants. The clothing matched what we could see in the tree. James was already on the radio to base camp, requesting climbing equipment and the body recovery team. I circled the massive trunk, noting the bark's condition and the surrounding ground. The Douglas fir's bark was typical for its species, thick, deeply furrowed, reddish-brown. No visible marks disrupted its natural pattern. No scrapes, no embedded climbing gear, no rope burns around the branches. The forest floor below showed normal leaf litter and fallen branches undisturbed except for small animal tracks. No climbing evidence, I reported, rejoining the group. No gear scatter, no climbing aids, no disturbance pattern consistent with a fall. The medical examiner made notes. Could wildlife have moved the body post-mortem? James shook his head. Nothing in these woods could lift an adult human body 40 feet up a vertical trunk and wedge it precisely between branches. Bear would drag it away. Cougar would cache it under brush. Scavengers would scatter it. This is... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Deliberate, Michelle finished for him. Like the jacket in the tree yesterday, we established a perimeter while waiting for the recovery team. Standard procedure dictated a 30-foot radius around the scene marked with orange surveyor's tape. The medical examiner prepared his equipment while 2 volunteers assembled the portable stretcher. I knelt to examine the ground directly beneath where Emily's body rested. The soil had compacted slightly in an elongated depression, a footprint partially eroded by rain but still distinguishable. I placed my own boot beside it for comparison. Slightly smaller than mine, consistent with a men's size 11. The tread pattern matched what we'd found on Kenneth's trail, waffle sole, likely REI brand, with the same wear pattern along the outer edge. I called James over. Kenneth passed through this exact spot. Pretty recent, last 24 hours, given the rainfall pattern. He crouched beside me, examining the impression. Single print. No trail. I searched the surrounding area. Just this one. Like he stopped. Stood here looking up. Then I gestured at the blank ground extending outward. Then nothing, James finished. The recovery team arrived 40 minutes later with professional climbing gear. 2 specialists secured their ropes and ascended the trunk with practiced efficiency. We watched from below as they reached Emily's position and began the delicate work of documenting the scene before moving her. Body is wedged securely between 2 branches, the lead climber reported through his radio. No visible trauma to exposed areas. No binding or restraints. Subject is wearing complete hiking gear, including backpack, still secured with chest and waist straps. The medical examiner made notes while James and I exchanged glances. This wasn't a body that had fallen or been placed. Emily looked as if she had been sitting on the branch and simply leaned back into the fork of the tree. Check her watch if she's wearing one, I called up. The climber acknowledged and carefully examined her wrist. Silver Timex, crystal intact. Hand stopped at 3:17. My skin prickled despite the mild temperature. 3:17, the same time displayed on the watch I'd found by the staircase. The recovery operation took nearly 2 hours. The team secured Emily's body in a special harness designed for vertical extraction, then slowly lowered her to the ground. The medical examiner began his preliminary examination while we maintained the perimeter and documented the scene. No obvious cause of death, he reported after several minutes. No visible trauma, no significant blood loss, no signs of animal predation or insect activity. He checked her eyes, mouth, and fingernails. Some dehydration was evident, but less than I would have anticipated after 3 weeks of exposure. What about time of death? James inquired. The medical examiner simply shook his head. Can't give you anything definitive under these field conditions. Based on the rate of decomposition, I'd estimate she survived at least 24, possibly up to 48 hours after her initial disappearance. He cast a brief glance up at the tree, which begs the question of why your search teams didn't hear her calls for help. This area was supposedly covered multiple times during her search window, correct? I nodded in agreement. We grid searched this exact sector 3 separate times following Emily's disappearance. Standard procedure, teams spaced close enough that a human voice would easily carry between them. If she had been up in that tree and conscious, we absolutely should have heard her. While the medical examiner meticulously completed his documentation, I turned my attention to examining Emily's backpack. The main compartment contained exactly what you would expect. Standard hiking supplies, a water filter, a comprehensive first aid kit, spare changes of clothes, and a selection of dehydrated meals. Her water bladder was completely empty, but otherwise undamaged. The side pocket contained a small journal with a waterproof cover. I carefully flipped it open, making sure not to disturb any potential evidence. The last entry was dated 3 weeks prior, the very day of her disappearance. Day 3 on the trail. Reached Blackwater Junction ahead of schedule. Weather's holding clear. I thought I heard something following me this morning. Heavy footsteps paralleling my route about 50 yards off the trail. When I stopped, it stopped, probably just a deer heading up to the ridge for some sunset photos, then making camp. The handwriting was neat and controlled, showing absolutely no signs of distress or urgency. I bagged the journal as evidence and then handed it to Michelle for processing. James approached just as the recovery team was preparing Emily's body for transport. Second victim in the same search area, he said quietly, almost to himself. Found in an impossible position. This isn't just coincident, Dave. No, I agreed. It's a pattern. We walked a few yards away from the others, lowering our voices as we spoke. Emily disappeared 3 weeks ago. I said, Kenneth vanished just yesterday. Both were experienced hikers, both were traveling solo, and both ended up in positions that defy any normal explanation. James nodded slowly, and both connected to the 3:17 timestamp. He looked back up at the massive Douglas fir. This is actually the 3rd case I've worked where bodies were found elevated far above ground level. Back in '92, up on Mount Rainier National Park, a male hiker was wedged 60 feet up a western hemlock. Then in '08, up on Fort Pinchot, a female trail runner was found high up in a cedar with absolutely no climbing marks on the tree. Both their watches had stopped at the exact same time. You never mentioned these cases before, I said, carefully ensuring I didn't sound accusatory. They're not official records, not as connected events. James simply shrugged. Some things we just discuss among the senior rangers we keep track of informally. Information gets compartmentalized. I thought about the staircase standing impossible and pristine in the forest clearing, about Kenneth's trail ending abruptly at those precise coordinates, and about Tyler Brooks and his fuzzy man. We need to compare notes, I said finally. Not just these two cases, everything unexplained, everything that didn't fit within normal parameters. James studied me for a long moment. There are others who have been keeping records too. Michelle has probably got the most comprehensive documentation. She's been logging incidents for 7 years now. Robert Wilson has encounter reports dating all the way back to the 90s. I decided, tonight, after we secure the scene and finish up today's search operations, my cabin up at Crescent Lake. The location is private enough for sensitive discussions, and it's pretty central for everyone involved. The medical examiner called us back over as they finished securing Emily's body in the transport bag. One more thing you should probably see, he said, pointing down at her hand. He had carefully opened her right fist, which had previously been clenched tightly shut. In her palm lay a small object, a polished wooden piece that appeared to have broken off of something larger. The wood had the exact same rich amber finish as the staircase I'd found that morning. Spindle fragment, James identified immediately from a balustrade. I photographed the item exactly as it was before carefully transferring it into an evidence bag. The wood felt warm to the touch, despite the cool ambient temperature and Emily's condition. We'll need to check and see if it matches that structure from this morning, I said, carefully choosing my words in front of the others. James nodded, almost imperceptibly. I'll expedite the testing personally. The helicopter returned to assist with body transport as we finished processing the scene. The pilot reported no additional thermal anomalies within a 5-kilometer radius. The afternoon search would continue with standard grid patterns, focusing primarily on the areas where Kenneth's personal items had been discovered. As the recovery team departed with Emily's body, I made one final circuit of the tree. The forest had gone quiet again. No birds were calling, no squirrels chattered in the branches overhead. The pressure I'd felt earlier had returned, a subtle weight against my eardrums. I knelt once more beside the single footprint beneath the Douglas fir. Kenneth Hayes had stood in this exact spot, looking up at a body that no one could have possibly known was there. The print's direction and depth suggested that he had stopped and remained stationary for at least several seconds. Had he seen something that we hadn't? Had he somehow found Emily before we did, and then continued on toward whatever had taken him as well? The coincidences were stretching way too far to remain coincidental. 2 missing hikers, 2 impossible positions, 2 watches stopped at 3:17, and now a direct physical connection. Kenneth's footprint beneath Emily's tree, and a fragment that matched the mysterious staircase. I marked the location on my GPS unit. 47 degrees 52 minutes 15 seconds north, 123 degrees 57 minutes 8 seconds west, less than a mile from where the staircase had appeared. We regrouped back at the command post at 2:30. The afternoon search teams were already assembling, volunteers checking their equipment and carefully reviewing sector maps. Helen stood by the communications table, marking locations of discovered items with colored pins. The Emily Carter case is now officially connected to the Kenneth Hayes disappearance, I told her, keeping my voice low. Physical evidence strongly suggests that Hayes encountered her location before disappearing himself. Helen's expression remained professional, but her posture tensed ever so slightly. Preliminary findings from medical, no obvious cause of death, survived at least 24 hours post-disappearance, position completely inconsistent with accident or wildlife interaction. She nodded once, processing the implications for our current search. Expand the vertical protocol, I said. Teams need to systematically check the canopy levels, not just the ground terrain. And every discovery needs timestamp documentation, particularly stopwatches or clocks. I'll update the search parameters. Helen turned back to the map, adjusting sector boundaries to incorporate the new information. Mitchell, you look absolutely dead on your feet. When was the last time you got any real sleep? I checked my watch automatically. Nearly 30 hours since any real rest. I'm fine to continue. Take 4 hours, she ordered. You're no good to Hayes if you miss something because of exhaustion. Peterson can lead the afternoon teams. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was absolutely right. Fatigue blurred observations, slowed reactions, and clouded judgment. I would need my full faculties for whatever was waiting at my cabin tonight. 4 hours, I agreed. Then I'm back on active search. James approached as Helen moved away to brief the volunteer teams. I've called Michelle and Robert, he said quietly. 8 o'clock at your place. Bring whatever records you've kept. I nodded, suddenly aware of the weight of my pack, the stiffness in my shoulders. Something's happening in these woods, Jim. Something that doesn't fit any training manual. No, he agreed, but it fits patterns. Patterns that some of us have been tracking for decades. He glanced at the searchers preparing to head out. Get some rest. Tonight, we compare notes and maybe we'll start making some sense of whatever's been taking people. I walked to my truck, the forest silence following me like a physical presence. As I started the engine, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the trailhead, a tall figure watching me through the trees. But when I turned for a direct look, nothing remained but the empty space between the silent firs. I woke to someone tapping on my driver's side window. The sound was sharp and deliberate. 3 quick raps followed by a brief pause, and then 3 more. My neck had cramped from sleeping upright, and my watch showed 11:43. I had meant to rest for only 4 hours, but had slept for nearly 6. The interior light clicked on as I straightened up, revealing a face outside my window. Kenneth Hayes stood 3 feet away, watching me with unblinking eyes. I recognized him immediately from his missing person photo, brown hair matted with dirt, rectangular glasses slightly askew on his nose, navy rain jacket now stained with mud along one sleeve. His expression remained neutral, his mouth set in a straight line. Kenneth, I fumbled with the door handle, nearly falling out of the truck in my hurry. Kenneth Hayes. He turned without responding and walked toward the trailhead, his movements fluid and deliberate. No stumbling, no hesitation, despite the near-total darkness between the parking lot floodlights. I grabbed my flashlight and radio from the passenger seat, leaving my pack behind. Hayes, stop. My voice carried across the empty lot, but Kenneth maintained his pace, disappearing into the tree line. I key my radio. Mitchell to base camp. I got visual on Kenneth Hayes at the main trailhead parking lot. Subject is ambulatory and heading east on the primary trail. Pursuing now. Static hissed back at me before Helen's voice broke through, thick with sleep. Copy that. Sending backup. Condition of subject appears physically intact, non-responsive to verbal communication. I jog after Kenneth, my flashlight beam bouncing across the packed dirt of the main trail. Subject is walking unaided. Continuing pursuit. Kenneth maintained exactly 15 yards ahead of me, close enough to keep in sight, but far enough to prevent interception. He never looked back, never varied his pace. The beam of my flashlight caught his figure in fragments, the blue of his jacket, the tan of his hiking pants, the steady rhythm of his boots striking the ground. Except they didn't strike the ground, not properly. I focused on his feet as we moved deeper into the forest. Kenneth's boots hovered approximately half an inch above the trail surface. Each step moved through the motion of walking, but never quite connected with the dirt beneath. No scuffs marked his passage. No prints appeared in the softer sections. The trail curved north around a massive Douglas fir, then descended into a shallow ravine where a wooden footbridge crossed Maple Leaf Creek. Kenneth didn't adjust his stride for the terrain changes. He glided down the incline without leaning back to compensate for gravity, crossed the bridge without the hollow thump of footfalls on wood, and ascended the opposite slope without any apparent effort. "Hayes, I need you to stop." I called again, louder this time. "National Park Service. We've been searching for you." Kenneth paused mid-stride. For 14 seconds, he remained motionless, one foot suspended above the ground, his body angled slightly forward. Then he resumed walking, his pace unchanged. My radio crackled. "Base to Mitchell, what's your location?" I checked my GPS unit. Half-mile east of Trailhead on the primary path, approaching the junction with South Ridge Trail. The unit's screen flickered as I spoke, the coordinates scrambling before settling again. GPS showing intermittent function. Subject is continuing east. Team is en route to your position, ETA 8 minutes. Maintain visual contact. Copy that. Kenneth reached the trail junction and turned north without hesitation onto the South Ridge path. This route narrowed considerably, bordered by thick salmonberry bushes on both sides. My flashlight caught the red, unripened berries, still hard and bright in the late spring. I'd measured the distance between us at 15 yards, and it never varied regardless of my pace. When I slowed down, Kenneth slowed down. When I broke into a jog, he accelerated precisely enough to maintain the gap, neither closing nor extending, as if tethered by an invisible wire. We passed the coordinates where we'd found Emily Carter's body. Kenneth didn't look up at the massive Douglas fir, didn't acknowledge the orange survey tape still marking our investigation perimeter. The air temperature dropped as we moved through this section, falling at least 8 degrees within 20 feet of the trail. My breath fogged in front of my face, despite the mild night. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects buzzing, no night birds calling, no rustling from nocturnal mammals in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and my boots on the dirt. Kenneth made absolutely no sound at all. 5 minutes later, Kenneth abruptly left the trail. He stepped into the dense undergrowth without breaking stride, passing between ferns and salmonberry bushes without disturbing a single leaf. The vegetation parted around him like water, and then closed again after his passage. I followed, marking the spot with surveyor's tape from my pocket. The brush tore at my pants' legs and scraped against my jacket. Thorns caught and pulled, releasing with tiny pops of broken stems. My passage left clear signs: broken vegetation, displaced soil, an obvious trail. Kenneth's left none. My radio squawked twice, and then died completely. The charging light remained green, but no amount of adjustment to the volume or channel dials produced any response. I pocketed it and continued forward, using my flashlight to mark the path through the increasingly thick forest. 300 yards from the trail, Kenneth stopped at the edge of a small clearing. 2 western hemlocks stood approximately 6 feet apart, their trunks straight and parallel like gateposts. Between them, the air appeared slightly thicker, almost shimmering in my flashlight beam. Kenneth turned halfway toward me. His face remained expressionless, but his right arm extended, his index finger pointing directly at me. Then his arm swung slowly until it indicated the space between the trees. "What is it, Kenneth?" What you showing me? I kept my voice calm and even, the way I would speak to a lost child. Kenneth's lips parted. No sound emerged, but his mouth shaped words that I couldn't interpret. 3 distinct movements, repeated twice. Then he stepped backward, directly between the hemlocks, and vanished. Not gradually, not with any distortion or visual effect. One moment, Kenneth Hayes stood between 2 trees. The next, he simply wasn't there. I approached cautiously, sweeping my flashlight across the area. The clearing measured approximately 30 feet in diameter, ringed by mixed old and second-growth conifers. The ground showed normal forest litter, fallen needles, small branches, scattered cones. No footprints, no disturbance in the soil, no sign that Kenneth or anyone else had ever walked here. The space between the 2 hemlocks appeared normal from a distance, but as I stepped closer, the air thickened perceptibly. The beam of my flashlight bent slightly when directed through the gap, like light passing through water. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees within 3 feet of the trees. I reached out my hand, stopping just short of the invisible boundary. The skin of my palm prickled, fine hairs standing on end. Static electricity crawled up my arm, not painful, but insistent. "Hayes," I called once more. "Can you hear me?" Nothing responded except the returning silence of the forest. I marked both trees with surveyor's tape and then used my GPS to record the location. 47 degrees 51 minutes 42 seconds north, 123 degrees 55 minutes 39 seconds west. The unit struggled to maintain a satellite lock, the screen flickering between coordinates before finally stabilizing. My radio remained dead. I performed a standard electronics check. Flashlight functional, watch operational, compass spinning wildly. I noted the exact time as 12:17 a.m., 27 minutes after starting pursuit. With no functional communication, and my subject vanished, protocol dictated returning to the nearest known position to re-establish contact with base. I marked my exit path with additional surveyor's tape at 20-yard intervals, creating a clear trail back to the South Ridge path. I reached the main trail at 12:32 a.m. 4 figures approached from the west, their headlamps bobbing in the darkness. James Peterson led the group, followed by 2 search volunteers and Michelle Adams. "Mitchell," James called. "What happened?" "We lost radio contact." "Equipment failure," I replied, holding up my unresponsive radio. "Subject disappeared approximately half a mile northeast of this position." I marked the route with orange tape. James passed me his radio. It functioned normally, allowing me to contact Helen at base camp. I provided coordinates and a brief description of events, deliberately omitting Kenneth's unusual movement patterns and impossible disappearance. Official channels required factual, verifiable information. Subject was non-responsive to verbal commands, I reported. Maintained visual distance, lost visual when subject entered heavy vegetation approximately 300 yards off South Ridge Trail. Copy that, Helen responded. We've scrambled the helicopter with thermal imaging. Return to base for debrief and equipment check. Negative, I countered. Request permission to lead the team back to the last known position. A pause followed. Then granted. Team 2 will continue from your current location. Full report upon your return. We retraced my path through the forest, following the surveyor's tape to the clearing with the twin hemlocks. The air temperature had returned to normal, and the strange distortion between the trees had vanished. Nothing distinguished this clearing from any other patch of Olympic National Forest. He disappeared right here, I told James, indicating the space between the trees. No trace, no disturbance pattern, no indication of direction. James examined the area with methodical thoroughness, sweeping his flashlight across the ground and up the trunks of both hemlocks. His expression revealed nothing, but the deliberate way he checked his compass told me that he'd noticed its erratic behavior. "Mitchell and I will establish a search anchor here," he decided. "Michelle, take Burns and Tompkins to execute a standard spiral pattern outward to 50 yards. Mark anything unusual, no matter how minor." While the others moved away, James stepped closer. "What are you saying, Dave?" I recounted the details I'd omitted from the radio report. Kenneth's hovering steps, the unchanging distance between us, the way the vegetation parted around him, and his final gesture before vanishing. James listened without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When I finished, he nodded once. "The same thing happened to Ranger Willis up on Fort Pinchot back in 2011. He followed a missing hiker for nearly a mile before the subject walked right through a standing dead cedar and disappeared." "You believe me?" I said, surprise evident despite my attempt at professional detachment. "Wouldn't be here if I didn't." James checked his watch. "We've got maybe 4 hours before dawn. The helicopter will be on station in 15 minutes. He looked up through the canopy. "If Hayes is still out here, his physical body, we'll find him before morning." The radio chirped before I could respond. "Air 1 to ground teams, we've got a thermal signature approximately 6 miles northeast of your position, ravine area below Robinson Falls." "Copy that," James responded. "Team en route to coordinates." We regrouped with Michelle's team and moved quickly through the forest, following GPS guidance toward the helicopter's position. The terrain grew steeper as we approached Robinson Falls, a 60-foot cascade that emptied into a series of connected pools before joining Blackwater Creek. The helicopter hovered above the ravine, its spotlight illuminating the sheer rock face and the churning water below. The pilot directed us to a narrow game trail that descended at a manageable angle. As we reached the bottom of the ravine, the aircraft's light fixed on a specific point midway between 2 pools. Kenneth Hayes lay face down at the edge of the lower pool, his right arm extended into the water. His blue backpack remained strapped to his shoulders, the same pack we'd found a strap from earlier in the search. The beam of my flashlight revealed dark discoloration along the back of his head and neck. James reached him first, pressing his fingers against Kenneth's neck to check for a pulse. The gesture seemed automatic rather than hopeful. Kenneth's skin had already developed the distinctive waxy appearance of a body several hours into rigor mortis. "Subject located," James reported through his radio. "No vital signs, requesting medical examiner and body recovery team." Michelle positioned herself upstream, documenting the scene with her camera. Each flash illuminated Kenneth's body in stark detail. The awkward angle of his neck, the dark patch of dried blood matting his hair, the pale skin of his hands suspended in the clear pool water. I knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Kenneth's glasses were missing, and a jagged laceration ran across his right temple, consistent with impact against the rocky ravine edge. His navy jacket showed multiple tears, likely from the fall. His hiking boots, REI brand with distinctive waffle-patterned soles, matched the tracks I'd been following for 3 days. The watch on Kenneth's wrist had a shattered face, water seeping beneath the cracked crystal. The hands had stopped at 3:17. County Medical Examiner Dr. Patrick Lambert arrived 45 minutes later, descending the ravine trail with practiced care despite the darkness. He conducted his preliminary examination while the body recovery team prepared their equipment. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height, Lambert reported, dictating notes into his recorder. Fracture to the occipital region, probable cervical spine damage. No defensive wounds or pre-mortem injuries visible. Time of death? James asked. Lambert checked the liver temperature and examined the progression of rigor mortis. Based on body temperature and environmental conditions, the subject has been deceased a minimum of 6 hours, more likely 8 to 10. He looked up from his position beside the body. If your report indicates visual contact at approximately 11:45 p.m., the subject was already deceased for several hours at that time. I said nothing, keeping my expression neutral as Lambert continued his examination. The facts flatly contradicted my experience. I had seen Kenneth Hayes walking, had followed him through the forest, had watched him disappear between two hemlocks. Yet his body showed clear evidence of having lain in this ravine since mid-afternoon. The recovery operation proceeded according to standard protocol. The team photographed, documented, and carefully placed Kenneth's body in a transport bag. 4 team members carried the stretcher up the narrow trail, while Lambert collected final samples from the scene. Dawn had begun to lighten the eastern sky by the time we reached the command post. Helen debriefed each team member separately, recording our statements for the official report. When my turn came, I provided the verifiable facts, finding Kenneth at the ravine, the condition of his body, the stopwatch showing 3:17. I omitted what I knew no one would believe. After completing my statement, I returned to my truck. The dashboard clock read 5:43 a.m. as I started the engine. I've been awake for nearly 24 hours straight, apart from my 6-hour nap. Exhaustion pressed against my temples, blurring the edges of my vision. I needed sleep, needed to process what I'd experienced. But as I prepared to drive away, something caught my attention in the rearview mirror. A tall figure stood at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the morning mist. Not Kenneth this time. This shape was broader, its outline indistinct, as if the edges didn't quite match the solidity of the trees around it. I turned in my seat for a direct look. Nothing remained but empty space between the silent firs. The forest had taken Kenneth Hayes, had arranged Emily Carter in a tree fork 40 feet above the ground, and had placed impossible staircases and clearings where no structures should exist. The same forest that had returned 5-year-old Tyler Brooks with stories of a fuzzy man and sleeping people standing in trees. I started my truck and headed for home. My shift had ended, but my investigation was just beginning. Tonight, I would meet with James, Michelle, and Robert, rangers who had seen enough to know that official reports rarely contained the whole truth. Tonight, we would compare notes on the things that moved through our forest, taking the unwary and occasionally returning them, changed. Chapter 7. I laid out 4 folders on my kitchen table, each marked with different colored tabs. The windows of my cabin rattled with the evening wind coming off Crescent Lake, its surface choppy with whitecaps under dark, cloudy skies. The propane heater clicked and hissed in the corner, struggling against the early June chill. The coffee maker sputtered its final protests as I filled the thermos. Caffeine wouldn't help the fatigue pressing behind my eyes, but habit demanded it. 29 hours since I'd had proper sleep, 17 since finding Kenneth Hayes's body in the ravine. James arrived first, knocking twice before letting himself in. He carried a weathered cardboard box secured with rubber bands, its corners softened from decades of handling. "You look like hell," he said, setting the box beside my folders. "Feel worse." I poured him coffee into a chipped mug that read, Olympic National Park Staff 2015 Volunteer Appreciation. Michelle and Robert are coming. 10 minutes out. Stop for food. James removed his rain jacket, hanging it on the wooden peg by the door. Water dripped onto the worn welcome mat, forming a small puddle. What have you got? I tapped the folders. Everything's strange. 17 years of notes about missing persons, equipment failures, geographical anomalies, cases where evidence contradicted itself, or physical laws. He nodded. Good. We'll need it all. The propane heaters cycled off, leaving a momentary silence filled only by the steady drumbeat of rain on the metal roof. My refrigerator hummed to life, its compressor straining against age. You've been tracking these things for decades, I said. Not a question. James ran his weathered fingers across his box. Since 1989, my second year as lead ranger. He paused. Lost 2 hikers in Cascade Pass. Found them 3 weeks later, sitting upright against a lodgepole pine. No signs of injury, exposure, or wildlife interference. Both watches stopped at 3:17. Oh, I finished. Yeah. He tapped the box. Started keeping separate records after that. Off-book. Things that didn't fit standard reports. Headlights swept across the cabin windows as a vehicle pulled into the gravel drive. 2 car doors slammed in quick succession, followed by footsteps on the wooden porch. Michelle Adams entered first, carrying a plastic grocery bag and a laptop case. Robert Wilson followed with a cardboard pizza box and his own weather-beaten backpack. Sorry we're late, Michelle said, setting the groceries on the counter. Accident on 101 slowed us down. She removed a bottle of whiskey from the bag. Figure we might need this. Robert placed the pizza box in the center of the table, carefully moving my folders aside. Steam escaped when he lifted the lid, carrying the scent of cheese and pepperoni through the small cabin. Food first, he said quietly. Then we talk. We ate methodically, like refueling vehicles. No one spoke beyond requesting napkins or water. The silence felt appropriate. 4 professionals preparing for difficult work. Through the window, darkness settled over the lake as clouds obscured what little moonlight might have penetrated. Michelle wiped her hands and opened her laptop. Oh, where do we start? I pushed my folder forward. Kenneth Hayes and Emily Carter. 2 cases, 3 weeks apart. Same region of forest. Same impossible circumstances. Both watches stopped at 3:17. James added his box to the table center. I've documented 87 incidents since 1989 that match similar patterns. 34 missing persons never recovered. 22 found in positions that defied explanation. 19 cases of equipment failure, coupled with temperature anomalies. He tapped the lid. 14 reported sightings of figures that shouldn't exist. Robert unzipped his backpack and removed a leather-bound journal. I've been recording encounters for 22 years. Personally experienced 11 events that violate known physics or biology. His voice remained soft, measured. Saw the entity directly on 3 occasions. Entity? I asked. No other word fits. Robert opened his journal to a hand-drawn sketch. The pencil lines formed a tall, broad-shouldered figure with proportions almost, but not quite human. Dense hair or fur covered its body. The face remained indistinct. Suggestions of eyes and mouth rather than detailed features. I recognized it immediately from Tyler Brooks's description. The fuzzy man who had cared for him during his 3-day absence. Michelle turned her laptop toward us, the screen displaying a spreadsheet with hundreds of entries. Each row contained a date, coordinates, and a brief description. I've been mapping incidents since 2016. Plotting them geographically revealed this. She switched to a topographical map of Olympic National Forest. Red pins clustered in 7 distinct locations, with the highest concentration forming a nearly perfect circle 5 miles in diameter centered on Blackwater Ridge. Everything within that circle shows statistical anomalies, Michelle explained. Temperature readings consistently 5 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit colder than surrounding areas. Electronic equipment failure rates 28% higher than baseline. Animal population densities 60% lower than equivalent habitats elsewhere in the park. James leaned forward. Show them the footage. Michelle nodded, clicking through files until she found a video player. Trail camera from Clearwater Junction, April 22nd this year. Family of 4 hiking northbound at 1,436 hours. The grainy footage showed a typical hiking family. Parents in their 30s, 2 children approximately 8 and 10 years old. They walked normally, the father checking a map while the mother adjusted her backpack. The children pointed at something off camera, excited. All 4 turned toward whatever they'd spotted. Then they vanished. No flash, no distortion, no gradual fade. One frame they existed, the next they didn't. Camera timestamps show no gaps or recording errors, Michelle said. Continuous footage, 30 frames per second. They simply ceased to exist between frames. Family was found 3 days later at Horseshoe Lake Campground, James added. 43 miles from their disappearance point. No memory of how they traveled there. Of their watches, I finished. All 4 watches. James confirmed. 2 digital, 2 analog. All stopped at the same minute. Robert turned pages in his journal until he found what he sought. May 8th, 2013. Routine patrol near Enchanted Valley. Found children's toys arranged in a perfect circle. 16 items total. Stuffed animals, plastic figures, wooden blocks. Nearest trail, 2 miles away. Nearest road, 7 miles. He slid a photograph across the table. The image showed exactly what he described. 16 toys arranged in a precise circle, approximately 6 feet in diameter. The ground within the circle appeared disturbed, as if something heavy had compressed the vegetation. I left the trail camera overnight, Robert continued. When I returned the next morning, all the toys were gone. The camera showed no human activity, no wildlife interference. He paused. At 3:17 a.m., the camera recorded this. A second photograph showed the same location in night vision green. The toys remained in their circle, but now a dark mass occupied the center. The image quality couldn't capture details, but the shape suggested something vaguely humanoid crouching over the toys. Temperature dropped 38 degrees Fahrenheit during that minute, Robert said. The camera battery drained completely by 3:18 despite being fully charged. I opened my own folder and removed the photograph of the staircase I'd found in the forest clearing yesterday morning at 0430 hours. Found this structure standing exactly where Kenneth Hayes's footprints ended. The image showed the perfect oak staircase rising to nowhere, 15 steps with carved handrails and ornate spindles. I placed beside it the evidence bag containing the wooden fragment found in Emily Carter's hand. The spindle matches the design exactly, I said. The lab confirmed the wood species and finish are identical. James nodded. I've documented 12 staircase appearances since 1997. Also documented 3 doorway structures and 1 complete hallway segment with no attached building. He spread several photographs showing similar structures standing impossibly in forest clearings. They appear without construction evidence, James continued. No tool marks, no material waste, no ground disturbance. They remained for varying periods. The shortest recorded was 8 hours, the longest 17 days. When they disappear, they leave no trace of ever having existed. Michelle added another data point. Every structure has been found within the circle I mapped. 89% appeared within 72 hours of a reported missing person. I tapped the photograph of Kenneth's stopwatch and the 3:17 timestamp. What's the significance? Robert closed his journal. Our time has different properties within the circle. Watches that stop always show 3:17. Hikers who vanish and return report experiencing only hours when days have passed. Children describe time moving differently. Like slow honey was how one 8-year-old put it. Tyler Brooks, I said 5 years ago, missing 3 days, claimed he was with a fuzzy man who showed him sleeping people standing in trees. Robert nodded. Tyler's encounter matches 11 other cases I've documented with children under 10. The descriptions remain consistent across witnesses who couldn't possibly have communicated with each other. James removed a folded paper from his pocket, spreading it flat on the table. The yellow document showed a handwritten report dated June 12, 1932. Earliest documentation I found, he explained. Ranger Howard Tillman reported finding a 6-year-old girl 3 days after she vanished from her family's campsite. The girl described being cared for by a tall bear that walked like a man and talked without a mouth. Said the bear showed her other people sleeping while standing up inside trees. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thicker, colder despite the heater's steady output. I moved to the window, checking that it remained securely latched. The glass reflected our 4 figures hunched around the table, surrounded by evidence of things that shouldn't exist. This isn't random, I said, turning back to face them. These aren't isolated supernatural events. There's a pattern, a purpose. Michelle nodded, adjusting her spreadsheet view. I have analyzed frequency against environmental factors. Incidents increase following seismic activity, however minor. They cluster during periods of heightened geomagnetic disturbance, and they've been increasing steadily. 22% rise in documented cases over the past decade. Something is living in our forest, Robert said quietly. Something that's been there longer than any of our records. It follows rules we don't understand. Operates on principles that violate our understanding of physical law. But it's not inherently malevolent. James added, children return unharmed. Some adults do too. The injuries we find, like Kenneth Hayes, could be accidents rather than deliberate harm. I spread the topographical map wider, studying the concentration of incident markers. We need to investigate the center point where the highest density of encounters occurs. Blackwater Ridge Junction, Michelle said immediately. Coordinates 47 degrees 51 minutes 40 seconds north by 123 degrees 56 minutes 15 seconds west. Elevation 286 feet. Less than half a mile from where I found the staircase. A noted /4 mile from where Kenneth vanished between the hemlocks. James looked troubled. Department regulations explicitly discourage unofficial research into unexplained phenomena. Regulations written by people who've never seen what we've seen, I countered. We have a duty to understand what we're dealing with for the safety of visitors and ourselves. Silence settled over the cabin. Outside, the wind had died, leaving only the soft patter of rain against the roof. My wall clock ticked steadily toward 11:30. Robert finally spoke. "I'll go with you." Michelle closed her laptop. "Me too. I'll bring recording equipment, thermal, audio, full-spectrum cameras." James sighed heavily. "When?" "Tonight," I said. 2,300 hours. We meet at the Service Road Junction near Blackwater Creek. Full gear, emergency beacons, overnight supplies. Tonight is, Michelle checked her calendar. June 3rd, new moon. Significant? I asked. She shook her head. Not statistically. Incidents occur regardless of lunar phase, but darker conditions might improve our chances of witnessing activity. We spent the next hour planning methodically. Michelle prepared her technical equipment, calibrating cameras, checking battery levels, syncing timestamp functions across devices. Robert laid out topographical maps marking access routes and potential observation points. James inventoried emergency supplies, first aid kit, emergency blankets, signal flares. I found myself staring at the wooden spindle fragment from Emily Carter's hand. The polished oak gleamed under my kitchen lights, its grain pattern forming whorls that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The wood remained unusually warm to the touch despite hours in an evidence bag. At 11:15, we packed our vehicles. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air heavy with moisture and the scent of wet pine. Mist clung to the surface of Crescent Lake, reflecting our flashlight beams in diffuse halos. "One last thing," James said as we prepared to depart. "If anything happens to any of us, the others document everything. No omissions in reports, no matter how unbelievable." We nodded in agreement. The stakes had shifted from standard search and rescue to something none of our training had prepared us for. Blackwater Junction, 2,300 hours, I confirmed. We find out what's been watching us from the woods. Michelle and Robert departed first, their truck's tail lights disappearing around the bend toward Highway 101. James lingered by his vehicle, eyes on the dark tree line beyond my cabin. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "the watch you found by the staircase. What time did it show?" 3:17, I answered. "Same as Kenneth, same as Emily's." He nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "Whatever we find tonight, remember it's been there all along. We're the intruders, not it." As James drove away, I returned to the cabin for my pack. Through the window, I caught movement at the forest edge, a tall, indistinct shape standing between two pines. When I looked directly, nothing remained but empty space between silent trees. I checked my watch. In 93 minutes, we would confront whatever had been taking people from our forest for nearly a century. Whatever had walked as Kenneth Hayes hours after his death, whatever had placed Emily Carter 40 feet up a tree without any signs of her struggling to get there. Whatever had shown Tyler Brooks the sleeping people standing in trees. I shouldered my pack, checked my flashlight batteries one final time, and locked the cabin door behind me. The forest waited, silent and watching, as it always had been. I parked at the Blackwater Service Road Junction and killed the headlights. The dashboard clock read 10:47. The rain had tapered off to mist, collecting on my windshield in tiny beads that reflected the moonless darkness. Through the driver's side window, the forest presented its usual nighttime face, black silhouettes against a marginally less black sky. James arrived 4 minutes later, his truck's tires crunching over wet gravel. Michelle and Robert followed in a Forest Service Bronco, parking alongside mine to form a protective semicircle. No one slammed doors or spoke above a necessary volume. The quiet felt appropriate, almost reverent. We gathered between the vehicles, headlamps aimed downward to preserve our night vision. The temperature read 48 degrees Fahrenheit according to the thermometer on my pack strap. Normal for early June at this elevation. Equipment check, Michelle said, her voice barely above a whisper. We methodically verified our gear. Handheld thermal imagers, digital voice recorders with external microphones, 2 full-spectrum cameras with infrared capabilities, and conventional digital SLRs with night settings. Michelle had brought a FLIR thermal imaging unit worth more than my monthly salary. Robert carried 4 motion-triggered trail cameras in his pack. Communications test, I said, clicking my radio to channel 6, our agreed-upon private frequency. Each ranger confirmed reception with minimal static. Battery levels showed a full charge on all devices. Location bearings, James said, unfolding his topographical map across my truck's hood. He traced our planned route with a weathered finger. We're currently here. Service Road Junction, marker 23. Target coordinates, lie 1. 4 miles northeast following this drainage. Elevation gain approximately 240 feet. Over that distance, Robert marked our position with GPS 47 degrees 50 minutes 15 seconds north, 123 degrees 57 minutes 42 seconds west. The unit functioned normally. Satellite lock maintaining a 5-bar signal strength. Timeline, Michelle asked, adjusting her pack straps. 90 minutes to reach the coordinates at a careful pace. I said, that puts us on site by 2300 hours. 6-hour observation window, focusing on the 3 to 4 a.m. time frame. Withdraw at first light regardless of findings. Robert secured his journal in a waterproof case. Rules of engagement, James answered without hesitation. Observe only. No interference regardless of what we witness. Emergency extraction only if a direct threat presents itself to team members. I nodded in agreement. One person maintains constant radio contact with the vehicles. First sign of equipment failure, we document manually. First sign of a physical threat, we withdraw immediately. I paused. Questions? None came. For beams of light swept toward the narrow service trail, leading into darkness. We moved in standard formation. James on point, Michelle and Robert center file, carrying primary documentation equipment, and myself as rear guard. 22 years of search and rescue operations had ingrained this pattern through countless wilderness traversals. Only our mission differed tonight. We weren't seeking to rescue. We sought understanding. The service trail narrowed after half a mile, transitioning from gravel to packed earth. Hemlock and Douglas fir crowded closer, their lower branches occasionally brushing our shoulders. Ferns unfurled along the path's edges, beaded with moisture that transferred to our pants' legs in damp patches. Every quarter mile, Michelle recorded ambient temperature and electromagnetic field readings. The first 3 checkpoints showed normal baselines, 47 degrees Fahrenheit, negligible EMF fluctuation, and standard atmospheric pressure. All equipment functioned within parameters. Wildlife sounds maintained expected patterns, the distant hoot of a barred owl, rustling of small nocturnal mammals in the underbrush, and the constant background whisper of wind through needle branches. At 11:22 minuto, isa. 1 mile from our starting point, the pattern changed. Temperature drop, Michelle announced, examining her digital thermometer. 44 degrees. A 3-degree differential from the previous checkpoint with no elevation or environmental justification. James consulted his map. We've crossed into the perimeter zone 3/4 of a mile from target coordinates. The forest composition hadn't visibly changed, but something felt subtly different. The spaces between trees seemed slightly wider than they should be. Shadows pulled more deeply into certain hollows. The ground gave differently beneath our boots, not softer or harder, just wrong, like walking across a floor you've known for years to discover someone has imperceptibly raised or lowered a single floorboard. Audio anomaly, Robert said quietly, removing his earphones. Background noise floor has dropped 12 dB from baseline. Ambient wildlife sounds are decreasing in 30-second intervals. I verified his observation through my own earphones. The forest was methodically falling silent around us, each layer of sound withdrawing like an orchestra section, finishing its part and setting instruments aside. Michelle stopped to swap batteries in her EMF meter. The unit drained to 15% charge despite fresh installation at the vehicle. She examined the device's display, readings spiking between 3 and 7 milligauss in 2-second intervals. No visible electromagnetic source. The temperature continued dropping as we advanced, 42 degrees Fahrenheit at 11:31, 40 degrees at 11:43, 37 degrees at 11:52. Our breath formed visible clouds by the time we reached the GPS coordinates Michelle had identified as the epicenter of activity. The location itself appeared unremarkable, a small clearing approximately 40 feet in diameter, ringed by mature western hemlock and scattered second-growth Douglas fir. A rotting nurse log bisected the northern section, blanketed with thick moss. Nothing visibly distinguished this spot from countless similar clearings throughout Olympic National Forest, except for the absolute silence. No wind moved the branches overhead. No insects chirped from the undergrowth. No distant owl called through the darkness. Even our footsteps seemed muted, as if sound couldn't properly propagate through this section of the forest. 33 degrees, Michelle reported, her voice unnaturally clear without competing background noise. A 15-degree differential from the trailhead baseline. James checked his watch. Let's establish the observation post. We worked with practiced efficiency. Robert mounted trail cameras at cardinal points around the clearing's perimeter, positioning them to provide overlapping coverage. Michelle set up her FLIR thermal unit on a collapsible tripod, aiming it at the clearing's center. James arranged his digital audio recorders in a triangulation pattern. I secured a 100-foot perimeter with high-visibility surveyor's tape, marking our exit route at 20-yard intervals. Standard procedure for maintaining orientation in case visibility decreased or equipment failed. The bright orange strips hung limply in the still air, abnormally visible against the dark foliage. By 12:26, we had transformed the clearing into a comprehensive monitoring station. 4 folding stools formed a small square near the western edge, providing unobstructed views while keeping us physically grouped for safety. Our headlamps remained on, sweeping methodically across the empty space before us. Battery check, I said, examining my flashlight. 3/4 capacity, 20% drain in 50 minutes of standard use. The others reported similar accelerated power consumption. Michelle's primary camera had dropped from a full charge to 62% despite minimal use. Robert's voice recorder showed half capacity. James switched his backup flashlight to active as his primary unit dimmed noticeably. Temperature continuing to drop, Michelle said. 31 degrees. Dew point reached. Frost formation should begin on vegetation within 60 minutes at this temperature and humidity level. Robert consulted his journal, consistent with prior documented anomalies. Temperature, electronic drainage, and sound suppression all match established patterns for significant events. We settled into observation mode. Each of us maintained designated monitoring sectors, documenting every detail in weatherproof notebooks. 30 minutes passed, then 60. The temperature stabilized at 29 degrees, cold enough that we cycled hand warmers from our emergency kits. James checked his watch at 2:15. No activity for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Battery levels continued to decrease at an accelerated rate. The primary audio recorder was now at 28%. We maintain position, I said. Historical data suggests the peak activity window is approaching. Robert removed a thermos from his pack, pouring steaming liquid into the cap. The coffee's aroma seemed abnormally potent in the odorless air. He passed the thermos around our small circle, each of us grateful for its warmth and mundane normality. At 2:43, Michelle's EMF meter emitted a series of rapid beeps. We turned toward the device as its display flickered between double-digit readings before settling on 17. 3 milligauss, nearly 20 times normal background levels. Signal originating from the clearing center, Michelle said, her voice steady despite the implications. No visible source. Pattern suggests coherent modulation rather than random fluctuation. The air in the clearing center seemed to thicken slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. No visible distortion appeared, but the space somehow felt occupied in a way it hadn't moments before. Temperature dropping rapidly, Robert reported. 25, 23, 21. Our breath formed dense clouds that hung motionless in the air. Frost appeared on exposed surfaces, camera lenses, metal equipment cases, the fabric of our clothing. The cold penetrated layers of technical gear designed for mountain conditions, settling into fingers and faces with unusual intensity. At 3:16, all our electronic devices failed simultaneously. Flashlights, cameras, recorders, meters. Everything electronic went dark in the same instant. Only our analog watches continued functioning, their mechanical movements unaffected. Time check, James said unnecessarily. We all knew what the moment meant. 3:16 and 50 seconds, I confirmed, watching the second hand sweep toward the top of my watch face. In the sudden darkness, the clearing transformed. The air itself seemed to vibrate, carrying a subsonic frequency felt rather than heard. The temperature plummeted to levels that burned exposed skin, well below zero, though we had no functioning instruments to measure it. Mark, James said quietly as his watch ticked to 3:17. The clearing center filled with pale blue light. Not illumination from any discernible source, but a glow emanating from the air itself, as if space were becoming selectively permeable to some spectrum beyond normal visibility. Within this light, human figures appeared. They emerged gradually, their forms translucent and oddly flat, like photographs projected onto smoke. I recognized Kenneth Hayes immediately, his rectangular glasses, navy jacket, and tan hiking pants exactly as I'd seen him nights before. He walked a precise path across the clearing, moving with the same hovering gait I'd observed during our pursuit. His expression remained neutral, his eyes focused on something beyond our perception. Behind him came others, a woman in blue technical gear I recognized as Emily Carter from her missing person photograph, an elderly man with a walking stick, 2 teenage boys carrying backpacks, and a middle-aged woman in a red jacket. The raincoat-clad figures moved independently, each tracing its predetermined path. Some crossed the clearing entirely, while others circled specific points before fading away again. None acknowledged our presence, and none interacted with each other. Their movements had the mechanical precision of programmed animations, not the fluidity of living beings. Perfect, lifeless repetition, devoid of variation or apparent purpose. "They're recordings," Michelle whispered, her scientific mind grasping for a rational explanation. "Three-dimensional recordings of past events." Robert shook his head. "Not recordings, echoes." The ghostly procession continued. Kenneth Hayes completed his circuit, vanishing at the clearing's eastern edge, then reappearing seconds later at the western entrance, repeating his exact route. Emily Carter walked to the clearing's center, stood motionless for about 30 seconds, then raised her hand as if reaching for something before disappearing entirely. At precisely 3:22 a.m., the blue light intensified. The human figures faded, replaced by a singular distortion at the clearing's center. There, bunched and folded like fabric being manipulated by invisible hands. Space itself seemed to tear a long and unseen seam. Then something stepped through. It emerged gradually. First, a broad shoulder covered in dense, dark fur, then a massive torso that stood easily over 8 feet tall. The head appeared last, vaguely canine in structure, but with proportions that defied all natural taxonomy. Its face featured deep-set eyes that reflected our presence without a trace of human expression. The entity stood fully materialized before us, neither threatening nor retreating. Its fur rippled even though there was no wind, each strand seeming to exist partly in our reality and partly somewhere else entirely. When it moved, the movement propagated through its form with a slight delay, as if different parts of its body inhabited different temporal frames. None of us ran. None of us spoke. Our breath frosted in the sub-zero air as we witnessed something ancient and impossible standing only 20 feet away. The entity raised one long-fingered hand, palm outward. Not threatening, but presenting. I felt a pressure inside my skull, not painful, but insistent, like the pop you feel during altitude change in an airplane. Images formed in my mind, not hallucinations, but communications that bypassed my sensory organs entirely. I saw Kenneth Hayes, as he had been in life, standing before a wooden staircase identical to the one I'd found in the forest. His face showed wonder rather than fear as he deliberately placed one foot on the bottom step, then another. As he ascended, his body became increasingly translucent until he vanished entirely at the 13th step. The image shifted. Emily Carter approached a different staircase, this one partially hidden behind a massive cedar. She photographed it with her phone, circled it twice, then reached out to touch the handrail. The wood fragment I found in her hand came from where the balustrade splintered under her grip. She pulled back startled, losing her balance and falling backward into an emptiness that shouldn't have existed. More images followed, dozens of hikers encountering staircases, doorways, and hallways throughout the decades. Some ignored the structures and continued safely. Others investigated but maintained a safe distance. Those who made physical contact experienced varying outcomes. Some vanished immediately. Others became disoriented and wandered deeper into the forest. Still others seemed marked somehow, becoming visible to the entity. The final image showed Tyler Brooks, the 5-year-old who had gone missing 3 years ago. Unlike the adults, Tyler saw the entity directly. The fuzzy man communicated with the child, showing him the sleeping people, translucent human figures suspended within trees, neither alive nor dead, but preserved in some intermediate state like insects in amber. The pressure on my skull subsided as the entity lowered its hand. It made no aggressive movements, maintained no threatening posture. It simply existed before us, a being following incomprehensible rules about which humans belonged in its realm and which remained outside its jurisdiction. James slowly reached for the camera hanging around his neck. The device had failed with everything else at 3:16 a.m., but he raised it anyway, adjusting the settings with practiced fingers. The entity made no move to stop him as he pressed the shutter release. The camera's flash erupted with blinding intensity in the darkness. For an instant, the entity stood perfectly illuminated, 9 feet of dense fur covering a frame that was both animal and not. Its eyes reflected green-gold light like a nocturnal predator. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth designed for neither herbivore nor carnivore diets, but for something outside terrestrial evolution entirely. The flash faded. The entity remained, unperturbed by the documentation. It raised its hand again, this time forming a gesture I somehow understood. Not communication, but acknowledgement. For humans had witnessed its existence and survived. For humans now knew the forest contained more than physical reality could explain. At 3:33 a.m., the entity stepped backward. Space folded around its form like water closing behind a diver. The blue light faded, and darkness reclaimed the clearing. The temperature began rising immediately, climbing 10 degrees in the first minute. Our electronic devices reactivated simultaneously at 3:37 a.m. Flashlights, cameras, recorders, all resuming function as if nothing had interrupted their operation. Michelle's instruments showed normal readings across all measurements. The forest remained silent, but the oppressive weight of wrongness had lifted. We sat motionless for several minutes, processing what we'd witnessed. James finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of decades in wilderness service. "I've been waiting 28 years to see that," he said quietly. "Didn't expect to survive it." Michelle examined her FLIR unit's recorded footage. Thermal capture showed massive temperature fluctuations, but no entity imagery. She turned to James. "Your camera." James checked his digital display. The screen showed a single image, the entity perfectly framed in the flash illumination. Every detail precisely as we had witnessed it. He silently passed the camera to each of us, allowing confirmation that the technology had captured what human senses might later doubt. "It's been here all along," Robert said, making notes in his journal with mechanical precision. "Since before recorded history, since before human habitation. Not malevolent," I added, "just operating under different parameters of reality." Michelle packed her equipment with methodical care. The staircases, doorways, hallways, they're constructed gateways between dimensions. It builds them as access points. I nodded, recalling the images transferred directly to my consciousness. Kenneth went willingly. His death in the ravine happened after something else had already claimed him. The body was just residue. We gathered our equipment and prepared to withdraw. The clearing had returned to normal forest temperatures, 45 degrees, according to Michelle's thermometer. Dawn remained hours away, but our observation mission had reached its natural conclusion. We had witnessed the entity directly and survived with documentation intact. The hike back to our vehicles passed without incident. Equipment functioned normally. The temperature remained consistent, and forest sounds gradually returned to expected levels. By 4:52 a.m., we had reached the service road junction where our trucks waited undisturbed. James secured his camera in a waterproof case, then wrapped that case in his jacket and placed it carefully on his passenger seat. The single photograph it contained represented the first documented evidence of something that had been taking people from these forests for centuries. "What happens now?" Robert asked as we loaded the remaining gear. I considered his question while securing my pack. No protocol existed for unexplained phenomena, though nothing in our training covered direct contact with interdimensional entities. We document everything, I finally answered, completely and accurately. What happens after that depends on who believes us. Michelle checked her watch. 5:03 morgens. Sunrise in 97 minutes. We dispersed to our separate vehicles, each carrying pieces of an experience that defied rational explanation. The entity had revealed itself deliberately, had communicated its nature and purpose without words. Whether that represented trust, a warning, or simply acknowledgement remained unclear. I started my truck and watched the headlights disappear around the service road curve as my colleagues departed. The eastern sky showed the first hint of lightning. Not sunrise yet, but the promise that darkness would eventually yield. In my rearview mirror, a tall figure stood at the forest edge. Not the entity this time, but Kenneth Hayes as I had first seen him, watching silently before turning toward the trees. His translucent form took 3 steps and vanished into the pre-dawn shadows. I drove toward home, toward the mundane reality of reports and protocols. The forest had shared its secret and had allowed 4 rangers to witness what lay beneath the surface of ordinary existence. What we did with that knowledge would determine whether we deserved the revelation. Dawn approached as I followed the winding road, carrying evidence of an impossible truth and the responsibility that accompanied it. The eastern sky had turned the color of wet slate by the time we returned to base camp. First light seeped through gaps in the cloud cover, turning forest shadows from black to charcoal. I checked the dashboard clock, 5:47 a.m. Less than 3 hours since we'd stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The command post looked abandoned. Rain-soaked maps curled at their edges on the folding table. Empty coffee cups clustered near the generator, which had stopped running hours ago. Search operations for Kenneth Hayes had officially ended when we recovered his body. I parked beside the blue evidence tent where we'd cataloged Kenneth's personal effects. 4 vehicles remained: mine, James' truck, the medical examiner's county Suburban, and Helen's Forest Service Jeep. Michelle and Robert had driven directly back to headquarters to begin documenting our findings away from questions. James approached as I climbed out, my joints stiff from cold and tension. He carried his camera in both hands like something volatile. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," he said. "Going on 3 days now." I rubbed grit from my eyes. Helen's still here, inside the command tent, finishing the paperwork. We stood in the gravel lot, sharing silence as the forest awakened around us. Chickadees called from the undergrowth. Wind stirred through western hemlock needles. Normal sounds returning to normal spaces after a night of impossible things. "What do we tell her?" I asked. James adjusted his ranger hat, his eyes scanning the tree lean. "Standard protocol for unexplained phenomena. Form 37B, classified under Interdepartmental Directive 16. The directive that gets filed and forgotten. The directive designed for exactly this situation." James tapped his camera. "Documentation without public disclosure." I nodded slowly. Form 37B existed for ranger observations that defied conventional explanation but posed no immediate public safety risk. It contained checkboxes for equipment malfunction, unexplained atmospheric conditions, and unusual wildlife behavior, nothing that explicitly acknowledged interdimensional entities, but the form created an official record while restricting access to senior personnel. We found Helen hunched over a folding table inside the command tent, a laptop illuminating her tired features. Papers surrounded her in organized piles: search grids, team assignments, medical reports. She'd coordinated search operations for 46 consecutive hours. Peterson. She acknowledged us without looking up. Medical examiner confirmed blunt force trauma as cause of death for Hayes, consistent with a fall from Western Ridge. Case closing as an accidental wilderness fatality. That's accurate as far as it goes, I said carefully. Helen saved her document and closed the laptop. You found something during the night sweep? Not a question. In 17 years of working these forests, Helen Vasquez had developed an intuition for when rangers withheld information. She didn't know about the entity, but she recognized when standard reports contained deliberate omissions. Conditions and observations consistent with Form 37B, James replied, using official terminology. Recommend documentation under Interdepartmental Directive 16. Helen's expression remained neutral. She understood the subtext. We'd encountered something beyond standard explanation that required special handling. I'll authorize the classification, she said after a moment. Evidence logs. I placed my notebook on the table. Comprehensive field notes, timestamps, environmental readings. Michelle and Robert are preparing technical documentation at headquarters. Peterson. James set his camera beside my notebook. Visual confirmation. Single image. Helen didn't reach for either item. Protocol dictated that 37B materials transfer directly to secure storage without intermediate review except by authorized personnel. She wasn't asking to see our evidence. She was confirming its existence for proper processing. You're both relieved from active duty for 48 hours, she said. Standard protocol following prolonged search operations and recovery. Appreciated, I replied. Helen gathered her papers into a waterproof case. Hayes's family arrives tomorrow to claim personal effects. They're looking for closure, not complications. Official report lists causes an accidental fall during solo hiking. Death certificate filed accordingly. The technical truth, though incomplete. Kenneth Hayes had died from a fall. The report wouldn't mention that something else had claimed him first, leaving behind only physical residue. I'll oversee family notification, I offered. Standard procedure. Helen nodded, then hesitated. Mitchell, I've worked with you long enough to recognize when something significant happens, whatever you documented. She paused. Does it change how we operate in these forests? A deceptively simple question with complex implications. I chose my words carefully. It contextualizes patterns we've observed for decades, provides a framework for phenomena previously attributed to equipment failure or observer error. Recommendations. I glanced at James, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Modify patrol routes to avoid documented hotspots during the 3 to 4 a.m. time frame. Implement equipment redundancy for search operations in sectors 4 through 7. Establish specialized briefing for rangers with more than 10 years of field experience. Practical measures that will protect both visitors and staff without revealing the full truth. Helen recognized the deliberate limitations of my response, but accepted them as necessary. I'll approve protocol adjustments through standard channels, she said, standing. Complete your 37B documentation by the end of the week. I'll ensure proper classification. She gathered her belongings and left without further questions. Helen had seen enough unexplained incidents during her career to respect the boundaries between observed fact and speculative explanation. The command tent felt suddenly larger with just James and myself. Morning light filtered through the canvas, creating odd shadows across the evidence maps. Kenneth's hiking route remained marked in red, Emily Carter's in blue. Their paths had crossed at coordinates we now recognized as an entity hotspot. "We need central documentation," I said. "Everything we've individually tracked needs consolidation." James nodded. "Secure storage at Ranger headquarters. Access limited to personnel with verified encounters. Michelle's mapping work forms the foundation. Robert's historical records provide context. Your photographs confirm visual evidence. And your case files connect the patterns." James finished. 23 years of field observation showing escalation and frequency. We packed essential materials in waterproof cases. The morning had warmed to 52 degrees, but low clouds promised more rain by the afternoon. Standard weather for early June in Olympic National Forest. The normal reasserting itself after hours of the impossible. I drove to Ranger headquarters while James secured our evidence in his vehicle. The building stood empty at 6:30 a.m. Early morning light reflected off the wet windows. Inside, Michelle had commandeered the conference room, spreading topographical maps across the table and connecting her laptop to the wall-mounted display. "Temperature anomaly data," she explained without preamble, pointing to colorized overlays showing cold spots throughout the forest, consistent with the entity's presence dating back to the first digital recordings in 2009. Robert sat nearby, meticulously transferring handwritten notes into a database. His normally stoic expression had softened into something like quiet wonder. Entity communication confirms accounts from 11 separate witnesses. He said, "Children's descriptions of the fuzzy man match observe morphology precisely." I checked the coffee maker and found it empty. Starting a fresh pot felt absurdly mundane after our night's experience. Yet the routine brought welcome normalcy. While the water heated and coffee grounds filled the air with an ordinary scent, I considered our position. For Rangers had witnessed something beyond conventional reality. We possessed documentation proving its existence. Now we faced practical questions about managing this knowledge. James arrived 15 minutes later, carrying his evidence box and camera case. Without discussion, we established our work areas around the conference table, Michelle with mapping and data analysis, Robert organizing historical records, James handling photographic evidence, and myself connecting case histories. We worked through the morning and into the afternoon, speaking little beyond necessary coordination. Each of us processed the experience differently. Michelle approached it as a scientific discovery, cataloging observable phenomena with methodical precision. Robert treated it with reverent documentation, preserving accounts with a historian's care. James maintained professional distance, focusing on operational implications rather than philosophical questions. I found myself vacillating between practical ranger and unwilling mystic. 23 years of unexplained cases suddenly made sense within this new framework. The missing hikers who left impossible trails, equipment failures in specific forest sections, temperature anomalies during pre-dawn hours, and children returning with stories adults dismissed as imagination. At 2:17 p.m., we gathered around a conference table to establish guidelines. The rain had returned, drumming steadily against the headquarters windows. For coffee pots stood empty, their contents fueling our work through fatigue and disbelief. "First principle," James began, his voice carrying the weight of senior ranger authority. "We protect both forest visitors and the entity itself." "Agreed," Michelle said. "Evidence suggests non-malevolent intent. Injuries appear incidental rather than targeted." Robert consulted his journal. "Historical patterns indicate the entity maintains territorial boundaries without aggressive expansion. It responds to encroachment rather than initiating contact." I added our fourth axiom, complete transparency within authorized personnel, complete discretion beyond that circle. From these principles, we establish practical protocols. Patrol routes would avoid documented hotspots during peak activity hours. Missing person searches would include specific procedures for supernatural indicators. Equipment redundancy would become standard in anomalous zones. Detailed incident logs would maintain continuous documentation for future rangers. Most importantly, we created an unofficial briefing for select personnel, rangers who had demonstrated openness to unexplained phenomena without compromising professional judgment. Not everyone could handle knowing what existed in our forest. Some would panic, others would obsess, still others would exploit the knowledge. We needed rangers who could acknowledge the impossible while maintaining a practical focus on visitor safety. By 6:45 p.m., we had constructed a functional framework for managing our newfound understanding. James finalized the document with a single line. The forest operates according to rules beyond conventional understanding. Our responsibility remains unchanged. Protect visitors from harm. Protect the forest from visitors. As we prepared to depart, exhaustion finally claimed its due. None of us had slept properly in over 48 hours. The adrenaline of the encounter had sustained us through documentation, but human limits reasserted themselves as evening approached. "Get some rest," James told us. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 2 p.m. to formalize procedures." Michelle secured her equipment in waterproof cases. I've set up recording devices at 6 perimeter locations surrounding the entity's last known position. Remote monitoring through a secure server. Robert closed his leather journal. Historical accounts indicate the entity retreats for 7 to 14 days following direct human contact. The pattern has held consistent since the earliest documented encounters in 1932. The four of us stood awkwardly in a conference room doorway, bound by a shared experience that separated us from colleagues who would never understand what we had witnessed. After a moment, Michelle broke the tension with unexpected pragmatism. "I need bacon. Large quantities. Anyone else?" "God, yes," James said. "Denny's in Port Angeles." My treat. The mundane suggestion lightened the atmosphere. We locked the evidence room and departed in separate vehicles, agreeing to meet at the 24-hour diner 30 minutes later. The drive through rain-slicked roads gave me welcome time alone with my thoughts. Kenneth Hayes's case file sat on the passenger seat. Official cause of death documented as an accidental fall. True, but incomplete. The entity had shown me Kenneth ascending the staircase voluntarily, becoming something between worlds before his physical form suffered a fatal injury. The complex truth would remain protected under Directive 16. 3 while his family received the simpler version that offered closure without existential disruption. At the diner, we claimed a corner booth away from other patrons. Our waitress brought coffee without being asked, clearly recognizing rangers coming off extended duty. We ordered breakfast foods despite the evening hour. Pancakes, bacon, eggs, hash browns, comfort meals that reaffirmed our connection to ordinary reality. "I keep checking my watch," Michelle said quietly, cutting her pancakes into precise triangles, expecting it to stop at 3:17 a.m. "I checked equipment function 11 times today," Robert added. "Temperature readings, compass alignment, battery levels." James nodded. "Jumped to my own shadow twice. Started categorizing every sound in headquarters as normal or anomalous." I understood their reactions. My own fingers had repeatedly sought my pulse throughout the day, confirming that blood still flowed at human rhythm rather than the strange temporality we'd witnessed in the entity. We adapt, I said. Find balance between awareness and function. Like rangers have been doing for 90 years, James added, stirring his coffee. We're not the first to see it. Won't be the last. The difference is we have documentation, communication, shared understanding. Michelle methodically arranged her bacon strips in parallel formation. I've requested a transfer to Olympic National Forest permanent assignment. Submitted the paperwork this afternoon. Robert nodded. Similarly, my temporary rotation ends in August. I've applied for an extension. Their decisions reflected my own thoughts. Having witnessed the entity, none of us could simply transfer to different parks and pretend our understanding remained unchanged. The forest had claimed us as surely as it had claimed Kenneth Hayes and Emily Carter, though we remained physically present. We finished our meals and settled the bill, each returning to separate lodgings. I drove to my cabin as darkness claimed the forest completely. Rain continued falling, gentle but persistent, filling the ditches along the forest access roads and streaming down my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. At home, I hung my rain gear on the porch hook and unlaced my muddy boots. The cabin felt both familiar and slightly wrong, like returning to a room where the furniture has been shifted by imperceptible degrees. I knew the feeling would fade with time. The world hadn't changed, only my perception of it. I showered, changed into dry clothes, and began typing my official report on Kenneth Hayes' recovery. The language remained clinical and procedural, documenting verifiable facts without speculation, location coordinates, physical evidence collected, condition of remains, and medical examiner's findings. My 47th missing persons case closed with standard paperwork. When the report was complete, I opened a separate document for Form 37B. This version contained everything the official report omitted: temperature anomalies, equipment failures, the staircase in the clearing, Kenneth's ghostly appearance hours after his death, and finally, the entity itself. I worked until midnight, documenting every detail with a ranger's precision. When finished, I saved the file to an encrypted drive for transfer to secure storage. Tomorrow, Helen would classify it appropriately, and Kenneth Hayes would join the catalog of unexplained cases stretching back to 1932. Before sleeping, I stepped onto my cabin porch. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of petrichor and the dripping of water from evergreen boughs. The cloud cover had partially cleared, revealing scattered stars between moving fragments of overcast. The forest stretched dark and silent in all directions, containing both ordinary wilderness and extraordinary mystery. I felt simultaneous relief and burden, relief at understanding the phenomena that had haunted my career, and the burden of knowing I would spend my remaining ranger years protecting both hikers and the entity from dangerous encounters. The forest's secrets would continue, but now I served as a knowing guardian rather than a confused observer. In the distant tree lean, something tall and dark moved between the trunks, visible only as an absence of lesser darkness. Not threatening, merely acknowledging. I raised my hand in the same gesture the entity had shown us. Not communication, but recognition across incompatible realities. The shadow paused, then continued its silent patrol through ancient territories we had only begun to understand. I returned inside, secured my cabin door, and finally allowed exhaustion to claim me, knowing the forest would remain when I woke.